Hello and welcome to our second panel, which is an ongoing conversation between theory and practice. I'm Lindsay Downs and I've just started a PhD here at Aberdeen. I'm a priest, autistic, and a mother to autistic children, some of whom have learning difficulties, and I'm your moderator for this afternoon. So I'll just tell you the shape of the session. We'll begin once I've introduced the panelists by giving them each 10 minutes to speak. And we'll go in the order of Stephen, then Mark, then Claire. And then they'll have a 20-minute period to discuss amongst themselves. And then we'll have a 15-minute break in which you can write your questions. And if you could please put all your questions in the Q&A, then the people who are working out which questions we get forwarded will see them, and they will publish them to the chat in the order that they're asked and answered by the panelists later. And we're going to have quite a nice long question and answer time. And all of the participants today have said they intend to be in the One-to-Me room afterwards. So there will be a chance to interact with them. So I hope it's going to be a good session. Thank you. So I'll start by introducing Stephen Bedard, who is an author and father. He's a pastor who blogs on disability and theology at www.disabilityandchurch.com. He's also available on Twitter. I've been following him recently, so we look forward to hearing what he has to say. Mark Arnold is the Additional Needs Ministry Director at Urban Saints, and he's the co-founder of the Additional Needs Alliance, a vibrant and fast-growing online community. He's an enthusiastic national and international advocate and ally for children and young people with additional needs, and is father to James, who's autistic, has learning difficulties and epilepsy. And so, another take. And then finally today we have Claire Williams, who's a lecturer at Regent's Theological College, specialising in practical theology. She's also completing a PhD at Durham and writing a book for SCM on Knowing God on the Spectrum, a liberation theology for neurodiversity. Claire was diagnosed as autistic herself as an adult. And so I'll hand over to you. I'll be doing the timekeeping. So, Stephen, you have your first 10 minutes.
Well, thank you for letting me be a part of this. My name is Stephen Bedard, and I'm here in lovely Canada speaking to you. So I come to this conversation wearing 4 hats. The first hat that I have, that I always had, was that of a pastor. I came to the autism conversation with that. I was a youth pastor, and we had a young man with autism, and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I didn't know anything about autism. And all I knew about autism is what I saw on Rain Man, and that was it. So I was very ignorant. A number of years later, I received another hat, and that was as a father of 2 children with autism. And they are significantly affected by their autism. None of them speak or use verbal language as their primary means of communication, and they both live in a group home right now. And so that was one of the lenses through which I saw autism. And then also I got another hat, and that was that of being diagnosed as an adult with someone with autism. And that was just 6 years ago. I was just looking at my diagnosis the other day, and just remembering how it was to get that diagnosis and to realize why I felt like I didn't fit in for so long, even as a pastor. And that brought a lot of answers to me. And then the fourth hat that I have, and the final one I'm going to be sharing with you, is as someone who has been studying disabilities in general, but autism in particular, as I just graduated with my Doctor of Ministry degree from Acadia Divinity College here in Canada. And I looked at disability ministry for small churches, as I've always been a pastor of small churches. What does that look like? And that has really given some focus to my ministry in how that looks with supporting churches, parents, individuals with disabilities in general. A number of years ago, I wrote a short book called How to Make Your Church Autism Friendly. Now, looking back, I'm not so sure about the title of it. I'm not sure that I'm happy with it, because the idea of being friendly, yes, that sounds good, but it could also be interpreted as someone who is like environmentally friendly. So what do we mean by environmentally friendly? Well, we try to limit the damage that we're doing to the earth. That's what we mean by environmentally friendly. To be autism friendly, does that mean we're simply trying to limit the damage we're doing to families affected by autism? I'm not sure that that's the right way to look at it. If it's in terms of being friends with people with autism, then of course that is what we're looking to do. But that's the title as it stands. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. It really emerged out of people being aware that I had children with autism and that I was a pastor. And I would get these frantic messages from church leaders saying, help, we have someone with autism. We don't know what to do. We don't know what that looks like. We're desperate. Please answer some questions. And I tried to respond to that the best I could in that book, writing down the things that most often I was getting asked about. I will say that it is very heavy on the storytelling, as instead of just listing, here's the do's and don'ts, I try to share our story. And there's a danger with that, as every family with autism has a different story. So I know that there are other people here on the panel who experience autism either as a parent or as someone with autism. And all of our stories are going to be different, but I really felt that that was the best way to go. I will also say that the emphasis is on the experience of us as a family, as opposed to an individual with autism. And that is one of the weaknesses. Part of it was because at the time that I originally wrote it, I did not have... Yes?
This is your 5-minute reminder.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. That I did not have my own diagnosis at that time. And so I was really coming at it in terms of our experience as a parent. And I'm also aware that the experience of parents and the experience of individuals with autism is very different. And sometimes there's actually conflict. There are those in the autism community, meaning those with autism, who are very much offended by some of the talk that happens by parents, that they feel that it is focusing on the negative when parents are grieving, when parents are struggling with raising their children with autism. There is some real disagreement there. I will just say that both stories are valid stories. The struggles that parents have are valid, and the experience of people with autism is valid. And we need to hear both of those stories. Basically, the two things I would just want to conclude with that I talked about here is the importance of figuring out what worship looks like in a church. What are you trying to do? And how does that fit if a person with autism is going to say or do something unexpected? Is worship a performance in which you are seeking excellence? You're seeking to impress people with how professional you are, and everything has to go together absolutely perfect. And if that's the case, what happens if something unexpected in terms of sounds and movement happens? If worship is something else, if it's something that's aimed directly at God, is how likely is it that God will be offended by those sounds or those movements? And then the other thing is that about discipleship. Discipleship is for everyone, and that includes people with autism. And so we need to seek to find out what are the best ways to disciple them, which is the exact same principle that we do with people, all people, whether they are neurodiverse or not. We talk about what their learning styles are, where they're coming from, what are the gifts that they have, what can they do. And of course, autism is such a spectrum. Their area of ministry might be anything from picking up the bulletins after the service to teaching a class on the intersection of science and faith. It could be absolutely anything. And so we need to give those opportunities for people and seek to really disciple people on the spectrum, not just to welcome them into the building, but to include them in the life of the church. And so that's really the focus of what I wanted to look at in terms of how to make our churches autism friendly. And there's been a lot of movement forward as people are more aware. And yet there's still so much work that needs to be done, especially in terms of hearing the voices of people on the spectrum. And that's all I have.
Thank you. You came in under time. Yeah. And I will hand on now to Mark Arnold. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, it's really great to be with you this morning. My 10 minutes is going to be trying to build a bit on what Stephen's just been sharing, but also to bring the voices of autistic children and young people in particular to the conversation. So there are some slides I'm going to use to help us do that. And at the end of the 10 minutes, there's a 1-minute video in which we'll hear from a family, and particularly a young person, an autistic young person. So I'm going to share screen. Hopefully then that will guide us through what we're going to be looking at for the next 10 minutes. Okay, so that's me. I've been introduced already. A recent study by the Department of Health in Northern Ireland suggests that around 1 in 22 children and young people are autistic. And that's quite a big shift from some of the figures that we have been using up until now. But for me, what that tells us, and somebody who lives in the UK myself, that suggests that in the UK alone, there could be as many as 500,000 autistic children and young people. You can do the maths if you're in different parts of the world as to what 1 in 22 means for your own population of children and young people. And yet, certainly in the UK and no doubt in other parts of the world too, autistic children and young people can find themselves marginalised, sidelined, excluded from church. And so we're going to unpack a little bit of that, some of the barriers that they might experience and face. And we're going to do that through 3 different ways of looking at this, through physical barriers, through people barriers, and then through program barriers. So those are the 3 lenses that we're going to explore this through. And as we start and think about that first barrier, the physical barriers that autistic children and young people can experience in church, the things that can make church a difficult environment for them to be in, and a difficult environment for them to then be able to receive and share the gospel, to engage in the things that are going on in church, whether that's in a main congregational setting or in children's or youth work. There can be many physical barriers that can make that particularly hard for autistic children and young people. Some of those barriers most of the barriers I'm going to talk about have been shared with me by autistic children and young people themselves or their families. So this is hearing from them about their experiences of the challenges that they've faced in a church setting. Loud noise is one, and that may not come as a great surprise to you. That can be common for a lot of people in church, but it can be an area of sensory overload for autistic children and young people too. And it might not just be restricted to a sound system or the PA system that's going on. It might just be the volume of people that are there, people moving around, people talking. It can be harder for autistic children and young people to filter out different elements of the sound that is all around them. And so it can become overwhelming. And on top of that, there can be specific things that can cause sound issues too. A fluorescent tube buzzing, for example, a fridge in the kitchen. All of these can potentially be difficult for autistic children and young people to filter out. Echoing noise can be potentially a challenge, and so can resonant sound. So a church organ, for example, can sometimes be a bit of an issue. I know a few children, young people and families have shared that their church has a church organ, and the resonance from that can be difficult for them. But it's not just restricted to sound. Bright lights can be a challenge too. Spotlights, fluorescent tubes can be overwhelming with the brightness and also that buzzing sound that we've been talking about. Flashing lights can be an issue there too. And even things like overwhelming smells, coffee and other smells that can be overpowering. So lots and lots of ways in which autistic children and young people can be overwhelmed through their senses, but also lots of people as well. We talked about the noise that can create, but also the sheer presence of so many people, feeling that their personal space is invaded. Unexpected handshakes or hugs can all potentially be difficult to cope with. And also signs that can be unclear as well. So in the example that I've given here on the slide, please turn the lights off when you leave the room. Well, if you took that literally, then if you were leaving the room, you could switch the lights off, plunging the rest of the people that are in the room into darkness. So there are all kinds of ways in which there are physical barriers and challenges that autistic children and young people can experience in church. Moving on to some of the people barriers that children and young people might experience in church. There are a whole range of these as well, and we're going to quickly highlight people's expectations, cultural issues and misunderstandings, as well as the use of metaphors and similes, all of which have the potential to be difficult for children and young people, autistic children and young people, to navigate through. So, for example, having to meet other people's expectations, such as about giving eye contact, or children being considered rude if they don't look at somebody that's speaking to them. Autistic children and young people are expected to change, to fit in and adapt, to be like non-autistic children and young people, which of course they can't, because they're neurodiverse, they're wired differently, and it's unfair to expect them to try and pretend to be and adapt to be something that they're not. But often that can be an expectation in church. Using metaphors like, her head is in the clouds, or often if somebody's really preaching a great sermon, we might say, wow, he's really on fire today. Those kinds of phrases can, if taken literally, be really quite confusing and alarming. And so again, that can be a potential issue for autistic children and young people. Sitting still, listening to somebody talking. We all, as Stephen said just now, have different learning styles, different ways of engaging with learning. So let's mix that up. Let's make sure that we're reaching autistic children and young people in lots of creative ways that play to as many of their senses as possible, not just expecting them to sit quietly, make eye contact, listen to what's being said from somebody at the front. But there can also be lots of cultural misunderstandings and issues as well, such as sometimes a belief that autistic children and young people are naughty. When, for example, if they're having if they're overwhelmed, having a meltdown, sometimes that can be considered bad behaviour, which of course it's not. Or that their parents are bad parents, which of course they're not either. And sometimes even that their parents have done something prior to their child arriving in the world that has resulted in them being autistic, all of which is false, but is a commonly heard phrase. Parents, families often tell me these stories. There can even be that ongoing view that an autistic child or young person needs to be healed, or even sometimes in the extremes of this, that they are in some way possessed and need to be freed from that. Of course, all of these views are profoundly wrong and deeply harmful and damaging, but autistic children and young people and their families experience these views all too often.
Mark, you've got just over a minute to go.
Okay, well, I'll quickly go through this, and then I've got a 1 minute video, so I'll quickly finish. Program barriers, unexpected changes, confusing programs, uncertainty of what's happening now and next. All of these unclear instructions can be hard as well. So being clear in what we're sharing with autistic children and young people is really important. Remember to ask families, ask autistic young people, ask autistic adults in our community to help us to learn and to know what the barriers are that they're experiencing. A video now that just lasts a minute that shares the story of a family and a young person.
As a mum, inclusion for me is really important. I mean, if we look at the Bible, Jesus included everybody, and quite often it was the ones that were on the edges of society. So it would be the women, the children, the disabled and the sick.
My name's Kieran. That's kind of as far as I'd ever go. Someone with Asperger's syndrome is someone on the autistic spectrum they might still struggle socially or emotionally with their day-to-day life and just need that extra support.
Outside of church, my son has been ignored a lot when he was at school. He would be the last person that would be included with anything or to be asked to parties or anything. Those invitations rarely came.
We're just like anyone else. We want to be a part of everything that's going on. Let us.
And finally, just some questions for you to reflect on in your own time. Which of those barriers do you recognise in your own setting? Who has the responsibility to identify and modify or remove these barriers? Is it autistic children and young people themselves, or church leaders, the rest of us that are in church? And who might you get to help you to do this? That's my 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. And so I'll pass on now to Claire. So Claire has her 10 minutes before the three of you get to chat together. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it will work nicely for everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'd like to present in my 10 minutes some of the theological moves that I'd like to make in my book that allow perhaps us to understand the issues in theology and church that have not benefited from autistic perspectives. This could be framed perhaps as an autistic theological hermeneutic. Alongside that, my work is an attempt to construct a profitable theology that is liberative, borrowing from the many predecessors in liberation theology the tools and methods that give voice to oppression and marginalisation. I'd like to prioritise for now my methodology for this approach and conclude with an outline of my book, which incorporates perhaps many of the themes in this conference, drawing together practices, lived and embodied experiences, autoethnography, and the considerable resources of the church and of theology. I approach my understanding of autism broadly, although with some nuance, from the social model of disability. It's my thesis that deviant and deficit models of autism have contributed to the subjugation of autistic individuals, and theology does have the resources and the motivation to aid in their liberation. It's also my contention that autistic life is a challenging life because of the many intersections, be they intellectual disability, social isolation, or the plethora of additional disadvantages attendant to existing in neurotypical society, and that it is reductive to suggest that liberation equals, without any qualification, simply acceptance of difference. Liberation cannot only be a recognition that neurodiversity exists. That is insufficient to the reality of the challenges faced by autistics. Recognition alone does not make use of the ways in which theology can speak to the lived experiences of difficulty and challenge that make up the daily lives of autistic people. The manner of the disadvantages, I believe, are the autism tragedy narrative, the notion of neurotypicality as ideal ethical type, following Rosquith, Stenning and Chown, and attendant to all those disadvantages, the stigma of autism, following Gates. Churches in particular, being my own and the interest of this conference, are prone to be sites of autistic othering. They are in every Christian tradition places where implicit behaviours are assumed but rarely explained. In the same way, theology has not been accessible for autistic people. It has traditionally sought to explain autism or to find analogies to it in scripture, which can result in dangerous associations with demonic possession or other unhelpful and inaccurate analogies. So I hopefully will briefly explain liberation theology and my use for autistic expression. Liberation theology seeks to free oppressed people from their situations of oppression. It is grounded in the work and lives of concrete humanity, ordinary humanity. It's also situated in the life of the worshipping church. Christopher Rowland describes liberation theology as, quote, "It is theology which above all often starts from the insights of those men and women who have found themselves caught up in the midst of that struggle, rather than being evolved and handed down to them by ecclesiastical or theological experts. Therefore, an autistic liberation theology must look at the lives of autistic people from their own accounts. There are, I think, for me, 3 stages for this liberation theology. Liberation theology demands action, but in a nuanced manner. It must move beyond aid and reformism, according to Leonardo and Clodovis Boff. This fails because it's othering and it removes agency. Liberation as a category for change allows those who are oppressed to work towards their own freedom. The second move is theological reflection. Hannah Lewis, in her Deaf Liberation Theology, suggests that it's possible for such a constructive understanding to challenge dominant narratives away from particular standpoints. This particularly requires the traditional sources of theological knowledge to be examined for their complicity in the repression of the marginalised. And my final move, to be completely reflexive, is to make it a charismatic and Pentecostal liberation theology in keeping with my own tradition. This is a relatively recent pairing for liberation theology, and I can point you towards sources for that, but it draws on the work of Selina Stone and a particular reading of Pentecost, which I believe helps with the liberative aims. A neurodivergent liberation theology has specific features. These are particular to the liberation it seeks. These are raising awareness of the situation of autistic and other neurodiverse people, the championing of liberative acts by neurodivergent people for their own liberation, the joining in of these acts by the church, and the drawing upon the traditions of the church to inform those acts and reflecting upon them in a way that is uniquely neurodivergent. Neurodivergent liberation theology must champion liberative acts in the manner that first liberation theologians championed liberation for the poor. This will have many outworkings. It will see the church come together alongside those who are neurodivergent to stand with them, not separate from them. This will be a significant act of solidarity with a group that is traumatically and systematically othered. It will seek accessibility and hospitality that does not look like accommodation, but rather radical acceptance. Radical acceptance does not mean make reluctant change to marginal institutional practices. Rather, it makes significant, wholesale and systematic change. Liberative acts of solidarity and radical acceptance will see autistic children who shout and yell as wholly, fully and completely part of the community of faith without patronising accommodation. It will structure relationships in the church so that autistic people belong in a fundamental sense, not as an outsider looking in, but an ontological member of Christ. It will champion the cause of autism in society in full solidarity, seeking structural change and improvement so that the rights and experiences of autistic people are centred. Theological reflection for the new liberation theology of neurodivergence will have a particular flavour. Hannah Lewis notes that academic theology creates a barrier to deaf people by making only certain forms of discourse permissible. Academic theology prefers analytical, empirical, and written forms of discourse, and other forms are disregarded or rejected. Lewis says this is educational elitism, where oral and signed forms of discourse are not acceptable. Her sources, she says, are not necessarily logical, but are poems, accounts, and notes of feelings. Autistic people do not, by definition, think in the same way as neurotypical people. This will have an impact upon their academic work. It cannot be that I and others like me have to change the way that we know and process information to meet a standard not designed for us. This is not a liberative process, but a hurdle. Rather, we should accept fragmentary, disorganised, and non-verbal communication as legitimate and acceptable theological discourse, and actively seek those theological voices that haven't been heard and have indeed been silenced. It will promote those voices that not only write on autism and theology, but on all aspects of theology. Throughout the course of my book, my aim is to connect theological ideas and practices to the cause of autistic liberation. So here's a quick sketch. One chapter will consider neurodivergent time as a particular and nuanced engagement with time, looking at the past of trauma, the future of liberal democratic production, and the present of overwhelmings, and engaging with crip theory to construct a theological account that allows for readings of trauma and time that is God's time, and as such does not require measuring and managing, increasing or decreasing, as death or taxes impose their demands upon it. Neurodivergent time is encompassed in the divine gift. Neurodivergent time does not need to be constrained by clock or calendar, but to be received as a gift from God. It is liberated from productive understandings of future earnings or value and of timekeeping and regulation. The present is not managed by meeting needs of others who hold stopwatches and diaries. The present is a fluid construction for a neurodivergence filled with sensory challenges and flexibility difficulties that present themselves with the intersection of autism and non-autistic worlds. Another chapter will hopefully explore neurodivergence, disability and eschatology, and consider the models of disability theory and the understanding of future hope in neurodivergent individuals. Is it even appropriate to consider...
Claire, you've got just under a minute.
Thank you, nearly done. Is it even appropriate to consider autism as a disability at all? And what does that mean for theologies that engage with autism? Perhaps most pressing for this particular panel, I hope to look at neurodivergent practices within the traditional models of autistic behaviour management and change. Rather than endorsing the understanding of changing autistic behaviour, we could look at how the church resources emancipatory and transformative practices. Following from Nancy L. Eisen's thesis that these practices can serve to re-symbolise the frameworks which are being liberated. The understanding and beliefs that are challenged and reformed as no longer shaped by dominant groups, but open to the diverse experiences from the margins. For example, I will look at the notion of stimming as sacramental. I would like to look at the notion of community and understandings of autistic community, in particular what St. Benedict and his rule offers for notions of community and stability and radical acceptance. I'd also like to reimagine community in a post-human context, understanding notions of kinship of creation as having creative potential for non-human community in autism. And finally, I will look at neurodivergent motherhood with the literature of mothers who are autistic, as well as potential reading of Mother Abbess in monastic theory as a way to aid reflection for autistic mothers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And so now you as panelists have got 20 minutes to discuss amongst yourselves in front of us what struck you about one another's 10 minutes, or where your interests might overlap or insights might differ. Okay, so I look forward to listening in.
So I guess I could start. I wanted to mention to Mark, I appreciated your presentation, and a lot of what you said about children and young people, really that applies to adults as well. I visited a church a while back, and a lot of the stuff that you said there, it was making me want to run out of that church screaming because I was so overwhelmed with everything that was happening. So that's someone in their 50s. But as I put my pastor hat back on and just imagine myself as someone maybe outside of the autism conversation, a lot of the stuff that you pointed out, that there's so many things that could cause issues with a young person with autism. Where do they start? Because if you handed them that list and said, okay, these are all the things you have to get rid of, that would seem pretty overwhelming. So in a practical way, where would you tell a pastor to start?
That's some really good points, really good question at the end there. And actually, where you started with that, which was talking about how a lot of the things I've been sharing about were relevant for adult congregational church as well, is picked up in a couple of the questions that have come in on the Q&A as well. And I think that's absolutely true. I'm a children's and youth worker. I work for a children's and youth work organisation, so that's always going to be my focus and where my attention is, because those are the stories I hear. Those are the experiences that are given to me, and the children, young people, and their families that I journey with. But absolutely, a lot of what I've shared is relevant right the way through, because as we know, children, young people become adults and continue through life as autistic. So absolutely relevant there. To consider your question of where would a church start, that's a great question, and one that I get asked a lot here. And my starting point would typically be sort of two or three things. But the first thing would be to say, if you were a church leader, do you know an autistic adult or an autistic young person in your church? Who do you know in your congregation who's autistic? Have a conversation with them. Have a chat with them about the things that can be barriers for them. Now, everybody's different. No two people are the same, but having those conversations will be a really useful starting point in beginning to understand what some of the barriers that autistic people might face. And then I think on the top of that conversation, and I'm coming back to your question again. It's not always about having to stop things, or change doesn't have to be a negative concept. Change can be a positive thing too. Another of the points that's come through in the Q&A is that actually dealing with some of the sensory issues that can affect autistic people can actually make church a better place or comfortable place for everyone. Change can be a positive thing. And I think it's trying to help church leaders to go on that journey, not as this is something we've got to do and it's going to be difficult and we're going to lose things as a result, but actually, how can we make church better for this community of autistic people and children and young people that we've got, but actually for us all. I think the starting point for me would be find some autistic people in your church community and have a conversation with them to understand the barriers and things that they find hard, and that starts to then give you some things to dig deeper into. Yes, it's all about doing this with people and not unto them.
Well said.
I think I find that quite a challenge, the idea of working with people rather than unto them. It's quite difficult, especially because so many different iterations of autism are so different. If you're a sensory seeking autist, you would have extremely different needs to a sensory adverse autist, and then speaking to them would not necessarily accommodate the other person's needs. So I think the challenge in churches is actually, how do you deal with the diversity within diversity, and make that work where so much of the needs are so different. I find that really a real challenge in my own thinking, as well as in places and situations like this.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's why I said just now, you know, no two people are the same, and so it's going to be a case of, you know, having those conversations with people, finding where there is some common ground, finding where there's differences, and then together going on that journey of how to unpack that and to create an environment that works as much as it can for everyone, you know. And it's not always a straightforward process, but if people go on that journey together and go on that journey with that goal of church being a better place for everybody as the end game, you know, and there's that positive end game to head towards, then it can be possible. And you know, the opposite of that is not doing it, and then everybody's struggling in different ways with different things. So at least going on that journey and hearing from people and understanding the challenges that each of them might be facing, then at least gives us you know, something to work from and work through together.
That diversity within the diversity, that's both the beauty and the challenge of autism, and it does provide some good opportunities, but there are some difficulties. Thinking about my children, you know, a intellectual, information-based discipleship would not work well with them. But in my doctoral research, I talked to a young man who was in a church, and they were trying to do discipleship in sort of a relational and experiential way, which was totally foreign to him. He needed the information. He wanted something more academic in order to do that. And they felt that was inappropriate, and they kind of shut down the conversation. So you can't just present, this is the way for autism. It just doesn't work that way.
I think you're right. And I think as well, all of this conversation we're having has a sort of cultural underpinning, really. The culture of the church needs to be a culture that says, hey, you know, we're going to journey with everybody. We're going to make church a place where everyone belongs, and where everyone can receive, everyone can serve, everyone can be whoever God's made them to be, and do whatever God's called them to do in this place. And that's another of those sort of starting points, really, is to start to think about, you know, what's the culture of the church right now, and is that a place that church leaders are happy with, or actually is there some progress that needs to be made to a different place? Because, you know, we're going to see different across the church community, across our congregation. We're going to see different responses to change. We're going to see different responses to you know, focusing in, as I do, on children and young people, autistic children and young people responding to a sensory overload. That's going to be responded to by members of the congregation in different ways. Some will be sympathetic and understanding. Some will be critical and consider it to be bad behavior or whatever. So it's taking people with us on that journey too, and developing that culture of inclusion and belonging for everyone. It can take time, but wow, it's great when you get there.
Mm-hmm. Claire, I wanted to ask you about some of what you've been working on in terms of the theological development. Mm-hmm. What can we do to help in theological training in seminaries or training of Christian professors to include this conversation more, because, or even to include people on the spectrum in that training, to have because there's just not enough pastors and professors who are on the spectrum, because it doesn't, the way we do our theological training doesn't necessarily fit with where they're at. So I was wondering if you could just comment on that a bit.
Yeah, sure. I think there's a couple of things, a couple of layers to that. I suspect there are a lot more neurodivergent pastors and seminarians out there than we know about, because it's still, I think, a shameful thing to admit, although I know of many that are now kind of speaking more openly about that. So I think there's that. I think that we prioritise the written word above almost all other skill sets in formation of our ministers, particularly in situations I've seen. So your ability to produce a well-formed and argued essay becomes the criterion by which you are judged suitable for ministry, which is inadequate and isn't going to ever meet the needs of even congregations, never mind individuals who can't necessarily form those essays. So I think we do need to sort of work towards ways of assessing and forming individuals that look beyond that academic paradigm. I like Nicholas Lee talks about fragments of theology, and I think that there's something in that metaphor, that idea that theology and theological reflection and formation can be a sort of fragmentary, non-linear process, and that is actually largely how we all operate. We just form our thoughts into linear thoughts to make them fit. But actually that can be very much how neurodivergent people think. And that's an acceptable discourse. And that's an acceptable way of forming a person for. But beyond that, we need to look at the kind of structural, institutional things that require you to have certain grades in certain exams to be suitable or eligible for selection. All of those sorts of things put barriers upon barriers in front of people who might be missing out on calls and vocations because of that. So, I mean, I'm interested. I'd be really interested in our Q&A to hear what other people's thoughts are about all that, because, you know, we're so wedded in our seminary formation and our training of ministers to academics. And, you know, of course, I make my living that way, so I'm pretty keen on it. But at the same time, I do think it limits us. It limits us to verbal communication. What about non-verbal communication or people that can't speak consistently, but have moments of silence? Well, theology has a lot to say about silence, but we're not really making any use of those resources in our formation, I think.
That's really good. So, I mean, Claire, thinking about that, where do you think change needs to come? How do we shift that? How do we make that change happen? And where do we start?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? And I think one of the moves of a liberation theology is to raise the issue in order to find people that can make that change. I think the liberation theologians of old didn't start with, right, I know what the change needs to be. They started with, right, well, I know that I need to stand in solidarity with the poor, and then find out what they think and give them agency, or allow their agency to develop in order to find out what the change can be, which is a dodge to the question, because I don't know exactly. You know, the idea of suggesting a kind of one sentence answer to a kind of structural change about access, it's just it feels like an overwhelming question, but it's not one that we should dodge. We should try and have these constructive conversations to find the answers, to give people access. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's about having these conversations. It's about having these conversations with, you know, the influencers and decision makers that are going to shift this in the future as well. And the more of these conversations we're having, and the more that this reaches the right people and gets them thinking differently, then hopefully that can start to influence change, and we'll see that shift happening.
You've got another 4.5 minutes if you have more things to discuss together.
Yeah, I think one of the things we could maybe talk about is that the paradigm of healing and seeing people with autism as needing healing. And yes, I do understand that that is inappropriate, and we understand that. But then speaking to the experience of parents who could be in a crisis situation with their child or children with autism, and needing God to intervene in some way, it's I guess. There's a messy middle that it's not necessarily we need to autism is bad and needs to be healed, but it's also not as simple as everything is great. Let's just celebrate the diversity and sing hallelujah. There's something in the middle there. I was wondering if either one of you want to comment about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I have very mixed feelings about all of that you raise. I think you're right. There's a real messy middle. I would not ever suggest that parents aren't having their own incredibly tough times and managing all the different situations that they come across. The question of healing, I feel like I vacillate on that on an almost hourly basis. Every now and again, if someone offered me a pill, I'd take it, definitely. And I can imagine that I wouldn't be the only one that would think that. I still think that actually what happens is that parents and children and adults, all who are affected by various aspects of autism, are all socially disabled. They're disabled by the world that makes it nearly impossible to operate in that kind of world. There must be more that can be done as a society to support people so that these conversations about treating autism and healing autism can slightly move on, not to say that they shouldn't be helped, because that would be awful, and I think that silences parents, and that shouldn't happen at all. But we need to move the conversation beyond that, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think what you're alluding to there is the sort of the medical model and the social model. So the medical model says that it's something you diagnose, it's a disorder, it's something that you heal or attempt to. The social model says actually, society, the world we live in, is designed for neurotypical people. And so neurodiverse people can find themselves disabled, in inverted commas, by the world around us. And actually, much of what families experience, my own included, in those more challenging times is because of stuff that's going on around us and in the world around us and with people around us. And so it's again, trying to raise that awareness, raise that understanding, start to shift and change the way that the world is modeled and made, so that it is a place that is diverse and accepting of and safe for autistic people, as well as everybody else, in which case then there's less of a focus on it being a disease or a disorder or a thing that needs healing, all of which can be profoundly harmful to people.
Yeah, having said that, Stephen, what's your answer to that question? You're experiencing it on a number of levels. I'm interested to hear that.
Right. So we definitely had many I hate autism days as parents. And I realized that many people with autism would find that absolutely offensive that I would even say that. But that's just the truth. That's where we were at. I think that, it's not the autism that has ever been the problem. It's other things that are going on. And I would not necessarily want to be healed of autism. I don't necessarily want my children to be healed of autism, but would love to see some changes in how they're able to interact with the world. And we've seen glimpses of that. We have had friends who got frustrated with us that we haven't prayed for a miraculous healing. And yet we felt that we've seen miraculous ways that other things have been provided. So, just having flexibility for God, that it's not put in your order and then wait for the results kind of thing.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sure some of these themes will be picked up again. What we're going to do now is have a 15-minute break, so you can have a sip of water or whatever you need to have. And whilst all the participants have a chance to form questions and to write them in. Okay, well, welcome back. If the panelists could all turn their videos on. That's great. And we have some interesting questions. They've kind of broken into three main themes. So I'll open them up to you. It's very interesting reading them as an autistic priest in a church who finds it sad that so many people find churches such a hostile place, and as someone who has worked for the past 4 years on changing the selection process for the Scottish Episcopal Church to better include people with neurodivergencies, and in training ordinands and continuing ministerial education for those in ministry to make them better aware of the needs of people with various neurodivergencies. So it'll be interesting to see how you respond to some of these things. So the first question that I was going to open up is from Rachel. Where's Rachel's question gone? Come on. Rachel Mackerel, who said, fantastic reflections, thank you. My question is in relation to the use of moral language and working as one diverse body of Christ. Church morality essentially equates qualities such as goodness, selflessness, gentleness, patience, self-control, and being godly. When someone who's autistic, but not all autistics, has neurodivergencies that makes these qualities harder for them, I worry there is a moral barrier to membership and interpersonal relationships in church and taking part in teams. How can we rethink our understanding of a good Christian to take in the limitations, but also the gifts of neurodivergent people at the same time? If you're pastoring or teaching someone who's neurodivergent and feel the need to manage or correct their behaviour or manage conflict, there's a real risk of a neurotypical pastor abusing their power over the neurodiverse people in a sort of Christian form of ABA. You need to submit to the authority of the church. You need to change your behaviour so other people in church can get on better with you. So it's open to all of the panelists. I don't know who might want to jump in first. Perhaps Stephen, you seem to have the full screen at the moment. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, that is a great question. So I'm very much come at these conversations with a discipleship focus. So my goal as a pastor is never just to get people to live up to a certain measure. It's not even where you are. If you imagine a spectrum of morality, it's about where we're headed, and we should be seeking to disciple all people, and that discipleship is going to look different for a lot of people, and where the areas that have to be worked on are going to vary from person to person. So we have to be careful that we're flexible with where a person on the spectrum is, but at the same time not to then be paternalistic and say, well, they have autism, so we're not going to expect them to be loving towards other people because they have that's what autism does. We don't want to do that. We just want to be flexible in how that looks and how that discipleship process is going to be.
Yeah, I think I would add into that there's been a little bit of research done that neurotypicality is considered to be the ethical standard to which people should be held, and that could do with some theoretical work to remove that as the idea. Much of moral behaviour in churches is cultural rather than perhaps getting down to the original norms and ideals. I mean, one of the biggest moral urges I think I read in the Bible is about community and belonging and drawing people in, not about what you wear or how you dress or whether you flap your hands about. So I think there's kind of cultural, ethical imperatives that need stripping away. But I also think there's something about I hesitate to use the word redeeming, but for want of a better one at the moment, redeeming some of those autistic behaviours to be seen as expressions in themselves, to be seen as moral behaviours, moral acts. That perhaps starts in theory, but also will then have to filter down somehow, which would be a good question, because those things aren't wrong. They're just conceived of as wrong by people that either don't understand them or aren't trying. So, so there's the classic example is children running around in the middle of a church service and that being considered naughty. All 4 of my children have persistently run around in church services. They're not, just because they're children, no matter what kind of child they might be. And I think that that means that they need to be accepted for who they are and allowed to participate as they are, rather than judged according to a cultural norm.
Yeah, absolutely agree with all that's been said. And a lot of this, as we've all been sharing, comes down to the culture of a church, and the culture of the church is set by usually the leaders of the church. So the responsibility of the leaders is to make sure that the culture is one that is accepting and inclusive, and where everyone belongs, no matter what they are bringing into the church community. In the context, because I'm a children's and youth worker, in the context of children and young people, I often talk to churches about meerkats and lions. So imagine a scenario where an autistic child is massively struggling with sensory overload and they're spiraling into a meltdown. In churches, you'll typically see 2 groups of people in those moments. You'll see the meerkats. The meerkats are the people whose heads lift up and spin round and stare in the direction of the family and their child who's struggling, and there'll be tuts and there'll be stage whispered comments about bad parenting, naughty children and all of that. But then there'll be the lions, and the lions look after their pride. They look after their own. They are very supportive of each other. And so the lions are the people that get alongside a family and say, hey, what do you need right now? How can we support you? And we'll be there bringing positive change to that situation. So what we need in our churches are more lions and fewer meerkats. And the way that happens is through church leaders calling out that bad behavior, the meerkat bad behavior when it happens, and in leading that culture change for themselves and making their churches a place where everyone belongs, whoever they are, whatever they bring, giving everybody the opportunity to be who God's made them to be. And fewer meerkats, more lions. That's why I have pictures of lions behind me on the shelf behind me there.
Right, I'm going to read. There are a number of questions that I think belong together now, and coming on from this, they all relate to having people who are autistic in leadership positions in churches, or they're from people about theological training. So there's a few of them. And so there are some which are making comments about the fact that they think we need it to be normalised for there to be neurodivergent people in all aspects of our life, including in leadership positions. So we need to know that we have our autistic priests about, and autistic treasurers, and autistic, whoever they may be in the church, not only people who need looking after, but people who are doing looking after. There's also, so Rachel Knoll has a question about that might want to come up in the chat now. There's also one from Tim Linford that's talking about the fact that he's in training in the Church of Scotland for his ministry and has survived his BD ONS and has recently completed his PG DIP MTH and did well in his 2 placements, pre-pandemic and middle of the pandemic. but he's pausing in his probation year for as short as possible a time to find a curious supervisor who'll explore with him his final stage of formation, asking the question, is it reasonable that he was asked to train in this way? And how do people, his real question comes down to, how do people like myself nuance our conversation so that it's not an overswing of the pendulum? I'm not always going to go to Stephen first, I promise, but Stephen, as a pastor yourself, perhaps you'd like to start with.
Sure. So just to clarify, the question is about how someone on the spectrum, like the process of becoming a pastor, is that correct?
Yes,
and if it should be the same way as for like the same process as everyone.
Yeah, there are two parts. Perhaps they should have been two questions. So the group is asking about how we see more, say, pastors that are autistic, and out of that, how do we even get them into and through training?
Yes. So, I mean, part of what needs to happen, and I think Claire mentioned this, that there probably are lots of people on the spectrum that are not out there, and that we need some more I don't want to say high profile. We need to have some leaders who are honest about where they're at. So there are some role models for it, because I can imagine that there are congregations who have an idea of what autism looks like. So one of the things that people think is that someone with autism lacks empathy. And so therefore you can't go to that person with your needs and receive any sense of compassion or anything. But that is completely false. That's not where things are going. But I can imagine that there would be people that would be worried about that. So we need some role models out there that are paving the way, demonstrating that there is effective ministry that is taking place, and that there is that autism really is that spectrum that goes right across. You're looking for people who are gifted for ministry, and that's the qualification, not what their neurological makeup is. So that would be where I would go in terms of training. I think that schools need to be more aware of neurodiversity, and not just autism, but all the other areas of neurodiversity, and to be actively providing. I want to be careful when I say accommodations, because that sounds like you're just making things easier, but that's not necessarily the case. But being willing to work with whatever area people might have some extra challenges in. And I think in my own teaching career, in undergrad level at least, I've seen that most of the schools I've worked with have been willing to work with those things and to equip neurodivergent people to be students.
Do you want to come in on that? Because you began to talk about that in the last...
So was that me or Mark?
Yes.
Only to really acknowledge that this is a really difficult question. I think that there are layers of misunderstanding. I mean, that Stephen kind of alluded to the sort of double empathy way of understanding autism. It's not that autistic people are unable to be empathetic, but there's a communication issue going both ways. I do think we've got lots of images of what pastors should be, what priests should be, that kind of interrupt the way that these processes develop. So we've got our sort of ideal type, if you like, of priest is well-educated, erudite, but with outstanding pastoral gifts of a particular type. And, you know, if you lack in any of those areas, or if you display those things in a way that's not that caricature, then you're going to struggle to engage in the system, which sounds all very revolutionary, down with the system. But there has to be some kind of structural change to those images and to those understandings. It's kind of like an imaginative exercise. We've got an imaginative potential here to change the views of what it looks like to be a called by God priest or pastor. And that is not necessarily what our imagination currently shows it to be. I think that if we start at that level, the kind of what's the telos of church leadership? Is it to be this ideal type, sort of lone wolf figure who can easily present their article to a journal at the same time as helping a bereaved couple on the side, this kind of brilliant multitasker? Or is it some kind of different version of that can do those things potentially, but doesn't have to do them in exactly those ways, so I think it's an imaginative exercise, and then it has to change on the level of the structures. So selection committees need to be educated and have changed their own ideas about what is suitable for ministry.
Yeah, and I think the reality is that there are quite a lot of autistic clergy out there, but also right the way through the church structure. The reality is that many of them, for all kinds of reasons, are unwilling to share their neurostatus publicly, and that again just brings us back to this whole sort of cultural issue of the negativity that society can show towards autistic people. If that culture can change, and days like this and conversations like this are a part of that change process, then we can get to a place where people are happier to be able to share their neurostatus, and that won't in any way be seen negatively when it comes to things like selection panels and all of that, because the reality is it does make a difference, and it shouldn't, but it does, and so a lot of people hide that and just muddle on in their own way. But we need to see that culture changing at every level, and days like this are an important part of that change process.
And to pick up there, because we've got a young man, James Scannell, who says he's 20 years old and has autism, and is what he's put in inverted commas, an unreliable speaker, meaning that his vocalizations are often impulsive. He says, I've learned to communicate authentically using a letterboard in the last year. I would like to know how a non-speaker can get theological training. So this is what James is thinking about. And James's mum has also put in a question, because she has said that as a parent, many people with autism have seizures and or self-injurious behaviours, and it's hard to view these as beautiful diversity. So can you address when you would find the language of healing to be appropriate? So we could perhaps, sorry, I shouldn't have put those two together. I was just saying them so let's start with James. Let's start with James with where he is as somebody who is an unreliable speaker, and then I'll restate the healing one because it comes separately, I'm sure.
Well, I don't want to keep answering first, but I'm going to jump in anyways, because I'm impulsive myself, and I won't pretend that there's no challenges there in how to do that, because there is a focus on verbal language and communication. And I actually thought that I would never become a preacher, in that I have some communication challenges, in that the way I describe it is English is my second language, but I don't know what my first language is. Yes. So I feel like I have to sort of translate in my mind before I say something and do something. And so I never thought that I would be able to preach every Sunday. somehow I've been able to do that. But one of the good things about where we're at in the church right at the this time, and I think COVID-19 has been a part of it, but there's other things, including how online we have gotten, is that there's been a democratization of ministry, in that we're not as locked into the formal structures that were there before, that there were certain gatekeepers before you could actually do ministry, that it was hard to get past them. And what I've seen over the past, especially the past 2 years, but a little bit longer than that, that there are more opportunities to be involved in ministry. It just might look a little bit different than what we have traditionally thought about. So using social media, videos, whatever. I mean, we need to hear these voices, in whatever way they come out, and even if that's through a language board or whatever, that we need to hear that. So I do think that there's a lot of hope right now, because the world has changed. Maybe it's changed kicking and screaming, but it's changed.
I think I would just add to supporting everything that Stephen said, but just adding some reflections from my own experience of doing the rounds of lots of theological colleges, Bible colleges in the UK over a number of years, where I've been invited in to come and particularly spend time with people that are going through youth ministry training. Has been the area that I've been invited into, and most of the time that's been helping prospective youth ministers to understand more about working with children and young people with a wide range of differences and diversities. But increasingly over the last couple of years or so, I think this was something that was coming in pre the pandemic, and since then, has been much more the colleges themselves wanting advice and help on how to accommodate autistic trainees and students in their programs. And so I think there is a shift happening, a willingness there to make what they do more accessible. Now, again, I'm only looking at this through the lens of youth ministry, because that's the area I'm in. And so I don't get so involved in more general ordinand training, etc. But certainly from a youth ministry point of view, there's a drive from the theological and Bible colleges towards a better understanding of how to accommodate and include effectively students with a wide range of differences and diversities and disabilities.
I think I would be interested to dream quite big on something like this. It should totally be possible to be non-verbal and be theologically trained, because it is completely possible to be discipled as a believer in any situation that you're in. I think if we took some of the ideas of radical acceptance and put them into theological colleges, we could get there. Theological colleges are kind of formed on that old monastic tradition of community living together, studying together and praying together. You know, if we really re-examine those roots, it could be done. But because it's still so sort of exam-based and assessment-based, you're having to really jump through so many hoops rather than live in a kind of a radical hospitality, a radical welcome that doesn't other people, but actually says, you know, of course, we're not just accommodating you, you're coming and fully being part of something that we gain from as much as you do. But I don't know what the practical steps are to making that happen, especially in a pandemic when everything's half online, half in person and all over the place. But it should be possible. And I think these conversations need to absolutely start happening at academic boards and in conversations amongst faculty and staff when they are aware of students that have these different ways of existing. Rather than trying to force them into the mold, they should be open to different ways of finding out what they know and how they know it and what they think.
Thank you.
Can I jump in with a go at James's mum's question?
Can I just restate that question and put the second one that goes with it? Because that question, which is about people having seizures and or self-injurious behaviours and how it's difficult to view these as beautiful diversity. And she asks, can you address when you would find the language of healing appropriate? There was another question asked at 1425 that says, if we believe in an almighty God, why is prayer for healing inappropriate? Isn't the issue much more the mental pressure in some circles that autistic people should be healed?
So, let's jump in and answer some of that. And I was particularly drawn to James's mum's question because, not least because my own son, who's 19, is James, and clearly shares some of what James is journeying with as well. I think in our own context and looking at this, and with myself and James, the distinction between the various aspects, because my own James has epileptic seizures, and I think it's a 30 times higher likelihood of having epilepsy if you're autistic. So there's a real correlation between the two. I think in our context where we've landed with it, and this might be helpful to James's mum, is that for James, being autistic is who he is. It's an important part of who he is. Epilepsy is something that he has, and there's a real difference between those two ways of looking at it. Would we like James to not have seizures anymore? Is that something that we could even pray about and hope that James could be released from? Maybe. Would we pray that James wasn't autistic anymore? Absolutely not. Being autistic is a fundamental part of who he is, of what his character is, of how he responds to the world. So it's distinguishing between different things. It's not. It's separating those out. The epilepsy is something different to being autistic, and so and I think bringing in the other question about is it appropriate to pray? I think the question was something about.
It was.
I've lost it now. So.
If we believe in Almighty God, why is prayer for healing inappropriate? Isn't the issue much more the mental pressure in some circles that autistic people should be healed?
There is that mental pressure in some places, in some cultures, that autistic people should be healed. And again, I think my own take on it is it comes back to that sense of, is this a part of somebody's identity, an important part of who they are? If that's the case, then is it appropriate to be talking about being healed of that? And I'm not sure it is. I think there's that distinction between what's part of somebody's character, part of who they are, part of their identity, and what's something that is another condition, another thing that they journey with, that potentially is something that could be differently looked at in that medical model as something that could possibly then be a request for healing.
I want to comment on that as well as a parent. Is it appropriate to ask for healing? Well, part of it is how you do it. I don't think it's appropriate to walk up to a person with autism and say, you are broken and you need to be healed right now. But if there is say a parent, we're going to do it as in the context of parenting. If a parent is having a really rough day and things are falling apart and, the house is being destroyed and siblings are being bloodied, and you call out to God saying, just take this autism away. There are worse prayers in the Psalms. If you look at what the psalmist cries out for. So I think that all of our prayers are appropriate on a certain level, and we don't have to worry that we're going to pray the wrong thing, that, we shouldn't have prayed that, and then God's going to heal them, and then we're going to feel guilty afterwards. God is an active participant in this and sorts through that. And I think he wants to hear those cries of requests for healing, whatever that might look like. And again, I realize that that's problematic for people who have autism hearing that. And I understand that as someone on the spectrum, but I think all of our thoughts, all of our struggles are worthy to bring to God, and just let God sort that through all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that is bang on. Stephen's got it in a nutshell. Prayer is absolutely, you bring the mess and you bring the requests that may or may not be valid or may not be the right thing to ask, because God can understand beyond our simple words that we form as a prayer. I think the damage about prayer for healing, if I can particularly focus on the negative, comes from the external pressures and the way that we form lots of, particularly, and I'm speaking from my own charismatic background, lots of the ways that we form various programs and ideas about general discipleship. So rather than necessarily anyone ever praying to heal autism in me, I've had lots of times when various constructs of what it means to be a spirit-filled Christian have resulted in me praying or being asked to pray for things that would effectively be asking to take away autistic traits. And that, I think, can be deeply traumatizing, because that imbues with powerful religious language, negative aspects to things that I can't change. And were I to have them changed, I don't know if I would know myself. And it's there that trauma sits, and there that damage is done. What if, for example, completely made up example, a person entirely learns all their communication non-verbally. If you were to ask them to pray to speak, their whole way of engaging with the world would be different. But their way is their way, and it exists as it is. And that is a damaging prayer. So I think there's a real risk in forming church practices that other discrete elements of people, rather than asking for prayer for healing. I mean, I totally understand those kind of gut-wrenching prayers in the moment, that I think probably all of us in one way or another will have done that sort of thing. Those are lament. They are, like Stephen says, there's absolutely ghastly prayers in some of the Psalms. I mean, gosh, that isn't the stuff that God hears that as genuine, honest expression. But it's when we enforce things like that, or, less traumatic things like that on other people, that prayer for healing can become so toxic.
I've now got 3 questions that really I have to address to Claire. And so 2 of them are short, so I'll do those first. Then the third one might open up to Stephen and to Mark as well, but they've come in multiple times. So the first is, when is your book out? Do you know?
No, I stated that yesterday. Sometime 2023, I believe. It's not written entirely yet, so...
In that case, the next question that comes in regularly is, are there any tasters or PhD preparation essays or anything people can get their hands on? Because they're very
PhD's in something entirely different, so that probably won't help. There's a chapter coming out in a trauma theology book that will be coming out sooner, so that might be worth looking. That's edited by Dr. Karen O'Donnell and Dr. Katie Cross, and that's an SCM book that will be out next year, sometime early next year.
Okay, it sounds as though it's going to be a bestseller when it comes out.
Yeah,
it's lovely.
In a reasonably niche environment.
And there are a couple of questions to do with your charismatic Pentecostal background, but the one I'm going to ask, because I found it interesting, so I'm being indulgent, is would you elaborate further on what you meant by stimming as sacramental?
Yes, well, I would if I'd actually thought it all through yet. But I think it's almost a provocative idea, because I think probably throwing it out there and calling it sacramental rather than, say, spiritual or worshipful provokes those sacramentalists out there who believe that there are only really one or two sacraments. But really what I'm trying to get at is that idea of reversing behaviours and practices that are traditionally thought of as autistic and potentially should be changed, and understanding them as actually ways in which people encounter God. So without having actually done that work yet, I can just muse kind of off script. So, for example, I probably read books in an autistic way, very obsessively. But when I read them about God, I consider that to be worshipful. Now, obviously, that's a fairly unique version. You know, not everyone reads. But I would say that draws me closer to God in a way that a bunch of other things that people would encourage in my charismatic background me to do would not draw me closer to God. So rather than framing that reading as dysfunctional and my lack of engagement with other practices as dysfunctional, I would want to rephrase it. So, and then for stimming, traditionally it's a repetitive motion, or, I mean, there's so many different versions of what you might call stimming, but why is that something that should be changed, something that should be removed or trained out of a child or suppressed as an adult? Rather, could that not be taking you into that transcendent space, that space that lifts your vision beyond your own immediate being? And as an embodied act, I mean, I don't know how many of you picked up on this idea that autistic people don't understand about being embodied. It was on Twitter this morning. But actually, rather saying, you know, stimming is an embodied act that lifts our gaze, that transcends our mundane. Instead of it being rooted in distractions, it's actually freeing us to be distraction-free and can be transformative, especially if that person takes that to Christ. That is my thinking. It's not quite, padded out yet.
Thank you. I don't know whether Mark or Stephen have anything to add to that or would like me to move on.
I'll just say something quickly about that. My daughter stims a lot, and I have always taken it as she's got her own version of sign language that she has created, and we can see in her she'll stim in such a way that it's rejoicing for her. You can just tell, okay, she is really having a good day by the way she's stimming right now. And then there are other times when she's lamenting, and she can use a different kind of stim for that. And people outside of that, outside of the relationship, don't understand what's going on. They just see hands flapping away. But those in relationship, and I would say in faith, that God recognizes the ways that she is sharing her the deepest parts of her through her stimming.
Yeah, completely agree with that. That's our journey too with James. He will have agitated stimming about something that he's upset about, but he'll have happy, delighted, joyful stimming when those emotions are going through him. So and you tune into the differences. You can see the differences in the way that he uses that as a tool and as a way of communicating. And so it's tuning into those different kinds of stimming and what they might mean for that particular person.
The thing about stimming is that it's not necessarily about what we understand by what's happening. Of course, that's going to be our perspective because we're looking potentially from the outside, but it's actually recentering the idea on what the person is experiencing, not what we think they're experiencing. You know, it could be that they are perpetually, effectively speaking in tongues with their hands all the time, but we don't necessarily know. So it's removing that kind of, I must explain this action, I must give words to it, when it's in its nature not a verbal thing. And actually, Scripture has quite a lot to say about the idea of non-verbal prayer in various forms, like I mentioned before, silence, but speaking in tongues. You know, it's almost like, in certain places, speaking in tongues is the language of angels. You know, well, what if stimming is as well? It's that sort of thing.
My
move.
Oh, sorry.
No
Yeah,
problem.
my son, he scripts from movies, and people tried to understand what he was trying to say through the words. And they listen to the phrase that he's using, and they're like, but I don't see how that fits with this context. And eventually I recognized what it was not the words that were being used, but it was the emotion of the character in the movie as they were saying that thing reflected the emotions he was feeling right there. So for example, in the middle of a church service, he said, "Just kill me now." And it was very funny from our perspective, but it had nothing to do with those words. He was that feeling of frustration that character in Lion King 1.5 or 2.5 or whatever it was, reflected what the emotions that he was having. And that was a new way for us to have an open window to his emotions. But we started with thinking he's passing information, so let's analyze the words, and it didn't work.
That's excellent. To take us to, I've found a final strand, and that was, there have been a couple of questions that have touched on, we've looked at barriers, we've looked at what makes things difficult, we've looked at inclusion, but what about the real blessings and gifts of having neurodivergent people mixed in amongst society at large? We haven't talked much about what they bring.
The only thing I have to say about this is probably going to slightly upset the person who asked the question, because I do understand what they're asking. But my worry with that is that you start to only value people for the things that they offer. And I know that's not the heart of the question, but it's a bit like that classic, Lord, just give me a healthy baby. Well, no, Lord, just give me a baby. You know, you don't necessarily want someone to value the contribution they bring. They should be valued for their very being, because they are made in God's image. And my worry, my worry with questions like that is that we start to have to look for the good in someone. Well, you know, we were a bit bothered about autism, but if we find something good about it, then we'll be able to talk about it. And I'm just slightly hesitant with that, although I totally understand that that's not quite the spirit of the question. I just like to flag that as it's not, we don't value people just because they have special gifts.
If you asked, what is it you value about neurotypical people in church, would it be the same? It wouldn't raise the same issues for you, would it?
No, as long as you're prepared to ask that for everyone. Yes, absolutely. You ask everyone that same question, and then I guess you follow up with, and does it matter?
Yeah. Okay.
I think the question in of itself is perhaps too broad, because rather than asking, what would I value about neurodiverse people in church, I think it's more a case of, what do I value about Kieran? Kieran might be autistic. He might have various other things that he journeys with. He might have skills, gifts, talents that he brings. Autism is a part of that journey. But what do I value about Kieran? What do I value about Tammy? I think it's much more individual than lumping everybody together and saying we value this group of people because of a part of who they are. I think it's down to how we value each individual, and whether they're autistic or not, or whatever they're journeying with, whatever age they might be, valuing each person individually for who they are, who God's made them to be, the journey they're on, the gifts and skills and talents they have, and creating a culture and an environment where whoever they are, they can flourish and grow and be discipled and respond to what God is doing in them and through them, and can be who God wants them to be and serve in whatever way God's calling them to serve. I think it's much more an individual thing than that broad lumping everybody together, if you understand what I'm saying.
I do agree with that. And yet I would also say that the concept of the church as the body of Christ and the emphasis of diversity in that passage. So that it's not so much that what autism brings, but what autism as one of those aspects of diversity, it turns it in. It's, for me, it's the difference between, a beautiful quilt made from different kinds of fabric compared to just a plain white sheet. And the beauty of the diversity that is there, and it can't just be neurodiversity, it has to be everything else, ethnic, cultural, physical ability, all these other things together, diversity in unity. To me, that's where the positive thing is in a more corporate way of looking at it.
Thank you. I'm going to just wrap things up now. I want to say thank you to all three of the panelists for the time you've given this afternoon and for giving us an awful lot to think about. So thank you very much. And it's been a real pleasure listening to all you have to say. So thank you.